It was a term that I came up with like 22 years ago.
Nice.
And I was like, men are sexually ill-clitorate. And ill-cliteracy is epidemic in this country. And we all need to get
so
clitoris.
A rich man's world. I have turned the soul of this
Ian, thank you so much for coming onto the Faking It podcast. It's so great to have you, to have a doctor who's specialized in so many things related to sex and pleasure. So I recently read your book, She Comes First, and I know that you've written it quite a while ago, so I appreciate you jogging back into your memory so we can discuss all the incredible, fantastical things that you wrote about in the book. And so as a woman, I just want to thank you for being a feminist and for writing this book. I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. There's not that many people who've gone through what you've gone through, what you mentioned and the reason that you wrote the book. I don't know if you're open about that. Can I publicly?
Absolutely, I'll talk about anything.
Cool. So in the beginning of the book, you just mentioned that you had ED, erectile dysfunction, and that was one of the motivating factors for you to like wanting to understand a woman's body and how to like pleasure them and do all the. You want to just go really quickly and say why?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it wasn't ED. It was it was actually a more common problem to men, which is early ejaculation, and I really struggled, and I wasn't able to connect the sex that I wanted to have in my head with my genitals, and it really led to a lot of disappointment and frustration, and just sort of being very hard on myself, and then. Eventually, when I really got to college, I started doing a lot of research, and I really started just trying to figure out, like, what is my problem and how do I change it? And I realized the problem was the whole approach to sex. And I started really researching a lot of feminist sex therapists and researchers, and really learned about the power of the clitoris, and that hell, even if I could last as long as I wanted and have the firmest, biggest erection in the world, it doesn't actually mean that my partners would enjoy sex. And so I was really, had to really just totally sort of reframe my approach to sex and get out of what I called the intercourse discourse, and just being obsessed with being able to do one thing and do it well, and just really expand my definition of sex. So that was sort of the genesis for She Comes First.
I think it's really interesting, this idea of intercourse discourse, because one, it doesn't just put pressure on men to have big penises to be able to last long. And that means, like, as a woman, that's what we want. How big is his dick? Is it a big dick? Like, that's what we talk about. But also, even for women, is her pussy tight? Like all this rhetoric around just penetrative sex, just this intercourse, which creates good, quote unquote, good sex, is what we're being taught. But what is this new idea that you're talking about that's also important? Because clearly the clitoris doesn't even get hit usually by the penis and penetrative sex.
That's right. There's what's called the clitoral vaginal distance. I don't know, maybe you've talked about this already on your podcast, but there's a few centimeters at least between the glands of the clitoris, which is the external structure of the clitoris. The thing that we have to remember is that penises grow outward. Clitorises actually grow inwards. But the external facing part of the clitoris, the glands, which is above the vaginal entrance, that can be 2 to 3, 4 centimeters. And it's a small distance, but it's actually a huge distance, because what that means is that most intercourse positions do not adequately stimulate the clitoris. And the clitoris is absolutely the powerhouse of the female orgasm. If you sort of look within the vagina, all of the sensitive nerve endings that contribute to orgasm are either on the surface of the vulva or really just within the first inch or two of the vaginal entrance. And that's not because the vagina has, all these sensitive nerve endings. It's because clitoral structures internally are wrapping around the entrance to the vagina. So even a vaginal orgasm is actually really a clitoral orgasm. The point of She Comes First was to really help men, and I coined the word clitorate, by the way. I'm pretty modest in the end,
I
but
love that.
It was a term that I came up with like 22 years ago.
Nice.
And I was like, men are sexually ill-clitorate. And ill-cliteracy is epidemic in this country. And we all need to get
so
clitorate.
funny.
And that was really the point of She Comes First. And if you take a clitorate notion to sex, if you really value female pleasure, then you have to break out of the intercourse discourse and you have to redefine what sex is.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, there's just one thing I want to touch on really quickly from what you said. Even when somebody has vaginal intercourse and has a vaginal orgasm, it's not from the vagina that they're really having that orgasm. There is no such thing as the G-spot inside of the vagina, which is something that you talk about on your book. Do you want to really quickly explain what that is?
Well, first of all, the vagina is really, it's a very important part of the body, but it's designed to do one thing, which is really to deliver babies. And in fact, delivering babies can be quite painful. So if anything, you want fewer sensitive nerve endings, the more. So what's happening with the clitoris? The clitoris is really a fascinating organ. There are internal structures. So basically, like, imagine like sort of what a wishbone looks like. So if you imagine like a wishbone from, say, a turkey, and the tip of the wishbone is actually sort of the tip or the glands of the clitoris that's sort of external, and it's what most...
The head, the clitoral head.
The glands. It's what most people would define as the clitoris, right? But behind the glands are really two legs, like on that wishbone, two very sort of elastic legs that are flexible and can fill with blood. And those legs wrap around the entrance to the vagina. And so when arousal is happening and blood is flowing to the genitals, it flows into those legs, and those legs wrap more tightly around the vaginal entrance. So now you can imagine whether you are penetrating with a penis, with a sex toy, with fingers, what you're actually doing is creating vibration against the internal clitoral structures, against those legs. Does that make sense? It's the friction internally that's creating vibration against the clitoral structure. So it's really still a clitoral experience, just happens to be internally stimulated.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's not really like a particular part of the vaginal canal that's more sensitive. It's more what's on top of a particular part of the vaginal canal, which is the clitoris, a clitoral cluster, that then has vibration from penetration or from finger stimulation.
Absolutely
that
right.
Then helps create
Absolutely
orgasm.
right. And the G-spot is an area, there is actually an area that's considered sort of urethral sponge, but without the clitoral legs wrapping tightly around that sponge and pressing it against sort of the ceiling of the vagina, there wouldn't be sensitivity. So all of the pleasurable sensitivity comes from clitoral structures. And that's why I think it's really important to think clitorally. My wife, I was just remembering, I used to have this very cool She Comes First t-shirt. I could actually get you one. But on the front it said She Comes First, and my wife came up with the phrase on the back, which was like, think outside her box. And it was just, again, to think outside of this idea of penetration. Penis to vagina penetration.
I think one thing that you said in your book that to me was really like eye-opening and revolutionary was when you said that penetrative sex is for making babies, and that's not all that sex is, you know? What do you like even mean? Like, because the fact that the clitoris is far away from the vaginal canal, like, that to me, it doesn't make sense. Like, can you explain what you mean by like how baby making is technically separate from sex? Or,
Yeah, well,
is that a hard question?
You know, a friend of mine, Emily Nagoski, who wrote
Come As You Are.
Come As You Are. She coined the term pleasure as the measure, right? So we should be looking at sex in terms of, first and foremost, in terms of pleasure. What was I going to say? I'm sorry, I lost my thought. What was the question again?
About like baby making versus sex and clitoris being far away from the vagina.
I'm a big fan of moving away from out of the intercourse discourse and really embracing outer course. You want to pause for a second? This is in New York. Welcome to New York City, Miriam. You're going to be dealing with a lot of noises.
A lot of cuts in my podcast episodes.
It's interesting. So when I'm working with couples, I would say about 95% of the heterosexual couples that I work with, if you ask them to describe the last time they had sex, and I wrote a book called So Tell Me About the Last Time They Had Sex, they're going to describe having intercourse. 95 to 100% of heterosexual couples are going to say, we either had intercourse, we attempted to have intercourse. When I ask those couples, how long did it take you to get to intercourse? Many say anywhere from 0 seconds. We just show up aroused and erect and naked and jump into bed and have intercourse, to about 7 minutes. It's actually rare to hear couples saying that they'll have foreplay for longer than 7 to 10 minutes, right? Everything is arranged around intercourse. Now, if you were to, there was a survey done of gay men around the last time they had sex, and the extent to which anal intercourse defined a sexual event. And in the case of gay and bisexual men, only 35% had anal intercourse. So if you're just looking purely at intercourse, you're looking at nearly 100% of heterosexual couples, and only 35% of gay and bisexual male couples. So what are they doing? What are the other 65% doing, right? They're engaging in outer course, right? What is outer course? It's the kissing, it's the hugging, it's the caressing, it's the manual stimulation of the genitals, it's the oral stimulation of the genitals, right? There's about 10 outer course behaviors that you can engage in. But what was interesting about the study of gay men is that I think it was like 25,000 gay men took these 10 behaviors and arranged them in 1,300 different sequences, right? So there's incredible variety as to what we can be doing sexually to sort of personalize. I call it the sex script, what we're doing during sex, to personalize our sex scripts to really create pleasure or to work around the problems that we're having. Again, like I started this because I was just banging my head against the wall. How can I have intercourse the right way? Well, fuck it. Throw intercourse out of the window. What is it? It's just one behavior. It's just a single behavior, a penis and a vagina.
Yeah.
It's no better or different than a mouth against a vulva or a mouth against a penis or hands touching or lips touching.
No, I think that's so interesting, especially the gay versus straight dichotomy and understanding that, because for me, I'm bisexual. And so I know that I was able to throw out all these rules about how you're supposed to have sex when I was with a girl, because who kisses who first, Right. What is second base? Like what, there's no technically home run with women. So having to have to go through those motions of like, okay, we're just going to do what feels good rather than what we're told we're supposed to be doing to reach maximal pleasure, then taught me the world of pleasure and being able to prioritize that, And so I think it's so interesting that gay men have been able to do that too, because they also are forced to not conform to this, like, given out set of rules of what sex is.
That's right. They're outside of the sort of the heterosexual, heteronormative, sex.
Right, exactly. The rule book. They don't have to play by the rules. And so I guess what your book does too is teach straight people that they don't have to play by the rules either.
The rule book sucks, right? Because if you're just focused on intercourse as a primary event, and men and women are equally focused on intercourse, right? That means that a penis has to perform perfectly. Well, guess what? That creates a lot of performance pressure, and penises don't perform perfectly or correctly. I deal so much with erectile impairment, erectile unpredictability amongst men. And guess what? Most of the men that I deal with, they're in their 20s. They're in their early 30s. These aren't older guys who can't get it up because they're old. No, these are young guys who are experiencing tremendous pressure in the shadow of the intercourse discourse.
Interesting.
What does it mean for women? Oh, I have to have an orgasm this way. And if I don't, or if it's painful, do I speak up or do I potentially, look like I'm a problem in some way? So I think, just blowing apart this intercourse discourse has really been the thread of my work since writing She Comes First, actually 22 years ago, the first draft.
I'm 23.
To today. I was probably thinking about it when before you were born.
That's pretty cool. That's awesome. So if you had to define sex, how would you define it?
How would I define sex? I would just say it's a physiological and a psychological experience that allows two people to really become absorbed in pleasure together. And I say a psychological experience. I don't know that we'll get into it today, but, I just think that our ability to tap into fantasy, to tap into psychological stimuli is so neglected. And that as a culture, we're just focused on the what are we doing physically part. Meanwhile, when we're masturbating, women can fantasize their way to orgasms without touching themselves. Men can get very usable erections just by thinking about sex or watching something sexy. So that's the power of psychological stimuli. Totally. But we're not bringing that to partnered sex most of the time.
Yeah, I love that. I love that definition of physiological and psychological.
Right. And getting absorbed, getting into the flow of sex. One of the reasons there's such an orgasm gap between men and women is not just the lack of clitoral stimulation. It's because studies have shown that for women, the closer they get to orgasm, parts of the female brain that are associated with outside stress and anxiety literally shut down. So it's literally like part of the female brain needs to turn off so that the other part can turn on. So getting into that turned off, absorbed flow state is crucial to sex.
That's so interesting. I'm reading this book right now called More Than a Body by Lexi and Lindsay Kite. So I think is authors.
That's cool. Good book.
Very good. And one of the things they talk about is how women tend to self-objectify in social situations. So self-objectification means they literally take themselves out of themselves and see what they look like. Like, how does my hair look in this moment? How does it look when I'm sitting, and they see themselves because they know what they look like. And so there's a part of their brain focused on how do I look in all of these situations when I contort my body in this way or in that way. And that I'm sure applies to in the bedroom too. And they're naked. So it's hard to let go because they're like, ooh, am I sexy when I'm in this 100%. Position with him? My stomach is folding over. That's not hot.
Well, it's interesting. So first of all, in sex therapy terms, we call that spectatoring when you're watching yourself having sex. And what's interesting, so She Comes First, in addition to being all about clitoral stimulation, really makes a case for oral sex as the key activity to engage in terms of creating at least female pleasure, and that a guy can do so much more with his tongue and with his mouth than he can with just his penis. And what's fascinating is actually a lot of guys really buy into that message. And when I'm working with couples, very often it's the female partner who doesn't want to receive oral sex. Why? Because of what you just said, sort of genital self-esteem issues. Oh, does he really enjoy doing that? I don't think so. Or how do I taste down there? How do I look down there? How do I smell down there? All of these performative expectations come into the bedroom. Yeah.
I've had partners where I don't care if they're hairy or not hairy. To me, it doesn't matter, but they would have to be freshly shaved in order for me to be near their vulva, And I'd be like, I genuinely don't care. I promise you, I think your vulva's sexy, know? And it'd be no. And so I think it's so interesting how society plays that role. Do you have any advice on how women can get over that self-esteem issue when it comes to being okay with letting men go down or anybody go down on them?
Well, I think that's where really communication comes into play. I mean, like I said, so I sort of felt sexually handicapped. I couldn't work with my penis the way I wanted to, and I wanted to be. Oops, I'm sorry, my stomach's grumbling. I don't know if you heard that. I didn't have. Okay, that's why I'm sort of holding my stomach.
Oh man, you need a snack.
Yeah, I probably do need it. It always happens during podcasts too. It must be a little bit of some kind of reaction. What were we saying again? I'm sorry.
How to help women get over that?
It's communication. So I've been with women and they've been uncomfortable. even my own wife at times hasn't, has wondered in the beginning, does he really enjoy doing this? If I can communicate though to a partner how much I'm getting off, how much pleasure I'm getting from giving, then that's going to make my partner feel so much more emotionally safe.
Totally.
And I think it's important for women not to fake it, right? Once you start lowering your expectations or start not self-advocating for yourself, then you're really going down, a bad path. So I think it's important for women to focus on their own pleasure, to learn what works for themselves, and to be able to self-advocate for that. Hey, I'm not getting enough clitoral stimulation. We need more foreplay above the waist, above the neck, or more foreplay below the waist. I need to bring a vibrator into the bedroom because I just need that level of vibration. Or, hey, let's mix it up. Let's have some intercourse and then go to the oral sex. Why does intercourse have to be a culminating activity? But look, Miriam, in any relationship, it's all about communication, right? You're not going to get through anything. You're not going to get through a shopping list without communicating to a partner, right? So if you're not going to communicate about sex and you're just expecting it to all just happen, just don't know how you're going to get anywhere.
Right. No, I think that's like in your book, you mentioned multiple times how the partner should always say 3 things before they go down. Like, I don't know if you remember this, but do you want to mention what?
Well, it wasn't like you had to say it.
Right. Or just has to be
but you
aware.
had to think about it and espouse it, because again, I meet so many men. I don't know if your readers will be surprised. Listeners will be surprised or not surprised by this. I meet so many men who are like, it turns me on so much.
Right.
And I could do it as long as it takes. And I love the taste and I love the smell.
Right.
And I love the immediacy of the experience. So holding that in mind, right? What you're doing is engaging and exciting and gives you pleasure. The taste is good. The smell is good. It's a pleasurable experience.
Right.
Holding all of that in mind and being able to communicate that to a partner. And look, it doesn't always have to be so matter of fact, I love cunnilingus and this is what I like. I mean, people don't talk enough during sex either. Totally. They don't communicate, what they're loving about the sex. I think that when our sexual brains are turned on, our appetites are turned on, and it's like going for a fantastic meal, right? Like if we went for a fantastic meal, I love going for sushi and omakase, right? It's one piece and fuck, man, you'll talk about how amazing is that piece. Wow, the taste, the textures, right?
Just at an omakase restaurant.
I love it.
Yeah.
We should be doing that during sex, letting our partner know, right? Thinking of our partner as this delicious meal and communicating that.
Love that.
But too often we get silent and we're not talking enough. Sex.
Totally. But I love what you're saying and just letting it be known that I love this. This turns me on. Even if you're the woman, you can ask your partner, do you like this? Does this turn you on? Just having that conversation is just so important to be able to relax and just enjoy. Because even me, people love cunnilingus. We love licking pussy. We love doing that. It's great. It's fun. I get so much pleasure from it. So many people do. And so it isn't just an act of giving. It's also an act of receiving. So I think a lot of women need to accept that and know that to be true, because it is true.
Yeah. And I think it's always surprising to me how, within the intercourse discourse, how about 80% of women do not orgasm consistently from intercourse and yet will not self-advocate enough. I work with so many heterosexual couples in which the female partner is like, oh, yeah, I have orgasms when I'm on my own, but I don't have them during partnered sex. I'm having partnered sex for a different reason. Right. Why not?
No,
orgasms.
I'll tell you why. I think I can say as a woman, being a woman throughout my entire life, the experience is such that we're not supposed to advocate for ourselves, period. You know, and if we have a partner who loves us, that's good enough. Orgasms has never really been something that we've been striving for. It's never been part of the bar, of a good partner. Right. That hasn't mattered as much.
Totally. And what I found is a lot of women think, for example, if my partner tells me, hey, I need this, or do more of this, or listen, that feels good, but can we not switch so quickly, right? They feel that something is wrong with them for even having to to talk about,
Yeah.
what works for them, or they're afraid of being seen as some sort of sexual problem. But, that's assuming that guys have so much ego wrapped up in sex that they really don't care about their partner's pleasure. And that's a false assumption too.
Totally.
All of the men that I work with, college students, graduate students, professionals, all of the men I work with care deeply about their partner's pleasure. Usually they care more about their partner's pleasure than their own pleasure.
That's awesome. That's really cool. Yeah. And so in terms of you talk about how in this intercourse discourse, there is sometimes cunnilingus, but it's usually just for 2 minutes or 3 minutes and it's part of the foreplay. Yeah. But in your book, you talk about how cunnilingus should be a part of core play. Do you want to explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that foreplay should be extended into complete sexual acts of connection and lovemaking. I also think that oral sex usually gets relegated to being like an appetizer on the sex menu and often occurs at the wrong time in terms of arousal, right? Like so many couples, so many guys will say, how quickly, we have foreplay, we kiss, we touch, we have oral sex. How quickly do you get to oral sex? Oh, I'm there within 30 seconds. Well, that's telling me that more than likely your partner isn't aroused and probably isn't ready for that level of direct genital stimulation. Right. So in turning foreplay into core play and including cunnilingus, it's also understanding that probably that kind of intense genital stimulation doesn't happen right at the beginning of a sexual event. It probably happens closer to the middle, leading up to the culmination of a sexual event. So cunnilingus is, it's a fantastic sexual behavior. Right. But great behavior, wrong time, renders it, ineffective. Right. So that's a little bit about sort of just thinking, putting intercourse aside. Like, what does sex look like, especially for a heterosexual couple, if you're not going to include intercourse? And sometimes that's my homework to couples. Go have just like outer course based sexual events for a while. I'm not saying you're not going to have intercourse again, but let's break free from like that intercourse discourse and just go have outer course for a while. Yeah. And yes, it's real sex. Think of it as real sex. Is it generating real pleasure? Is it generating real orgasms? Then it's real sex. If the intercourse that you're having isn't generating real orgasms, isn't generating real pleasure, then maybe you're not actually having sex, even though you're having intercourse.
Whoa. Damn. Yeah, fuck yeah. No, I love that. That's really, really good. I think that we all need to do that. What I decided after reading your book is that when I have my next male partner, whoever they may be, I will make them read this book before they sleep with me. So they have that mindset too of just being able to me, it seems like having a queer approach to sex,
Yeah, it is a queer approach to sex. But so let me ask you, because you're so much younger than me. Yeah. And look, I work with a lot of people your age, but it's in a more clinical environment. Like you just said, like the next time you have sex with a guy, you're going to, make sure you're getting the clitoral stimulation you need, right? Is there a hurdle to getting that? Like what's happening like with your generation?
Yeah, my generation, I would say that I'm definitely obviously different than most people now because I am more sexually empowered. So when like the last one night stand that I had with a guy, brought my vibrator in my coat pocket, Yeah. Like it was a date and like we both knew that probably something was going to happen. And then I took it out during sex and I was like, I want to use this. Is that cool with you? And he said, sure. Like he didn't care. Yeah. And then afterwards I asked him, has a girl ever brought a vibrator for like the first time that you slept with them? And he said, no, and I said, was it fine? He's like, no, I loved, like, he was so ecstatic about it, honestly, because I orgasmed. I had pleasure. Yeah. And he was like surprised that I orgasmed. So it seemed that most of the time when he sleeps with a girl for the first time, they don't orgasm. And so I would say that from my friends in my generation, they tend to not have orgasms with their partners. Like for the first few times, maybe if it's a committed relationship, they do, but there is still a lot of like hardship. And then another thing too, is that sex has become more rough with my generation is another thing that I've heard. And that's like more due to porn.
So tell me about that a little bit. Is it like, even in hookups, is it just less tender, less romantic, or less feel like, I don't even want to say lovemaking, but just like a real sensual experience?
Yeah, I mean, like the first time I ever had sex, I was like super ready. I was 21 years old. I'm like, I'm ready to have sex now with a guy, you know? I remember he like was choking me. He was pulling my hair, and I was like, don't do that. Don't do that. Yeah. And it was my first time having sex. It was hard. It was very hard for me to speak up at that point. Wasn't sexually empowered. So I only spoke up when it was like legitimately physically painful. And, but if it was uncomfortable, I didn't say anything. It was only like when it was like real pain that I was like, don't do that.
And do you think guys are doing that for their own pleasure, or because they think that women are into it as well and want that?
I think he thought that I was into it because he said to me, he's like, oh, that's the first time a girl ever told me to not choke her.
Right. There's a woman named, I don't know if you've interviewed her, Cindy Gallup.
I have,
actually. Make love, not porn. And I think that that's, very true, that the guys internalize a lot from porn and actually think that, that's the sex that women enjoy. Right. And, I don't know, like, why wouldn't a guy also want to be tender or loving, even in just a casual one night stand or a hookup? Totally. Why not take your time and really let go and think of it as like an erotic massage? What, that wouldn't be cool or something? Or
it's not cool. It's not what anybody does really right now. It seems like,
it's too
unfortunately.
That's too bad.
So that's why we need to advocate. That's why it's like, okay, if this is what you want, I think that guys are very open to doing that if you ask for it, or if you say like, I want to have soft sex, or like I want it to be gentle. Like I think you just have to set that expectation, and then they're very open to that and like also get pleasure from that. So that's what I try to tell people.
Right.
That's
my message. The moral of the story is, more than likely we didn't grow up in sex positive homes. Yeah. I know you didn't grow up in a sex positive home, right? Yeah. More often than not, we grow up in like a sex negative home. I don't know if your home environment was sex negative, and probably most of us have grown up in sex avoidant homes, and what we just don't talk about it. And so then that continues into adulthood, right? That's sort of where continuing what was modeled for us. And what I'm sort of hearing you say is sort of what I said, which is, hey, if you just start talking about it in a constructive and self-advocating way, like everyone can be flexible. Totally. Everyone can be open-minded.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the last thing I want to talk to you is just a little more practical advice in terms of how to do cunnilingus. Is there any, like, I know in your book you mentioned all these different methods, so there isn't really any particular way, but if you can just give our listeners something that they can carry on to their partner or do on their partner.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I would say to, anyone who wants to perform good cunnilingus, don't think of it as something that happens right at the beginning. Think of it as something that happens in the middle when your partner is already really, very warmed up, and sex is very warm and very percolated, and everyone is really aroused. The second thing I would say, especially to men, is do not make your tongue like a substitute for a penis, right? It's not about penetrating a vagina with a tongue. It's not about, being like a cobra or something, with your tongue, or just going nuts. And I would say, if anything, it's really about letting a female partner lead in a way. Okay. And so what does that mean? It means, I guess my tips would be, focus on stimulation, not penetration. Focus on being very consistent and very rhythmic. Focus on stillness, and letting a partner push into you and sort of grind against, your gums and your teeth, right? It's really, if you think about it, one of the most popular sexual positions that most consistently leads to orgasm for women is woman on top. And that's because a woman is able to get that direct clitoral stimulation by exactly positioning her clitoris for the position she wants, the kind of stimulation, the level of pressure. Well, do the same thing with your mouth and really let a woman lead. So if cunnilingus is a dance, a woman is really taking the lead in it, and a guy should really be tuned into following based on how she's leading. I would also say forget all the showmanship and the flash. Just focus on persistence, consistency, stillness, and really, especially as a partner is approaching orgasm, not changing what you're doing. What's interesting about men is, as a man goes through the plateau phase of sexual response and heads into orgasm, he reaches a point of ejaculatory inevitability, whether with or without further stimulation.
Right.
He is going to have an ejaculation. That's led to a whole genre of porn called ruined orgasms, where women pull back that stimulation at the last second. Women do not reach a point of orgasmic inevitability. So a woman can actually lose an orgasm even as it's happening.
Wow.
So that's why it's really important for a guy, again, to follow his partner's lead and to not change up what he's doing.
Yeah.
If it's working. And of course, the title of my book is She Comes First.
Right.
And I think the approach should really be on orgasms that are asynchronous and happen in serial, one after the other, not necessarily in parallel. I think it's much easier to aim for serial orgasms that are very closely connected in time, as opposed to going for some kind of simultaneous orgasm. Usually, if you're going for a simultaneous orgasm, you're going to end up with a guy who ejaculates first and a female partner who's gotten really maybe pretty close, but hasn't gotten to orgasm.
Got it. Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. I hope people take this with them into their bedroom.
I hope so.
Or any particular place. But yeah, thank you for having this conversation with me.
You're very welcome,
It was
Miriam.
really incredible.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, cool. Awesome.